Welcome to this section today entitled Nurses, Narcotics, and Negligence. My name is Brett Thompson May. I'm General Counsel for the Mississippi Board of Nursing. So glad to have this opportunity today to share with you some insight about the board makeup. We're going to talk a little bit about the licensure requirements, and then we're going to talk about the law and some of the regulations that the board's promulgated with regard to nursing practice. And then I'm going to walk you through some actual case studies that have gone before the board where there have been facts. You'll get to read and I'll present the facts of the case, and then you'll get to see what the board decided given the law applied to those facts. So without further ado, let's get going. What is the purpose of the Mississippi Board of Nursing? Fundamentally, the Board of Nursing was created to protect the public. Sometimes there is confusion because they will think, some will think that the board is an association and that it is an advocate of the profession versus a protection of the public, being a consumer protection agency, which is what we are. We do want to advocate for the profession when we can, but our primary focus is to protect the public. That is what the legislature, when they created us and enacted our statute, that is the absolute focus of what we do. So licensure requirements are in place to protect the public. Scope of practice, those issues are decided with the public protection in mind. And then the disciplinary hearings, those are also in place to provide a protection to our public. Now, as I mentioned, when we talk about how the board protects the public, well, we do so by regulating nurses with licensure requirements. So, for example, when you apply for a nursing license, only duly qualified applicants are issued a nursing license. Well, what is a duly qualified applicant? If you go to our rules and regulations, and I do encourage you to look at our website, www.msbn.ms.gov, and under the legal tab, you will see law and you will see rules and regulations. You really do need to familiarize yourself with this body of law and the rules, right? Because ignorance of the law is certainly no defense if there is an alleged violation of the Nurse Practice Act. But when we're talking about licensure requirements, that is one way that the board can ensure that there is some measure of protection for the public, because we don't let just anyone be a nurse, right? You must go to school. You must go to a school that has been accredited, right? You must graduate from that school. The board needs to receive a transcript, an official transcript that further evidences your graduation. And you are required to submit to a criminal background check as an additional requirement, part of the licensure requirement. And again, all of those qualifications that you must meet are put into place because the public, the bigger picture here of who you will be serving, there needs to be a protection in place. So that is one of the functions of the board and how we protect the public. You'll see here the regulation and enforcement side. Certainly the board is charged with the duty to have up-to-date regulations in the profession. Nursing is evolving, healthcare is evolving, technology, certainly as you have even learned through some of your courses, I'm sure, has taken healthcare to a whole nother dimension, and it continues. So because of that, nursing laws will evolve through time, and the board is going to be charged with making sure they keep up with those trends to make sure, again, that public safety can be addressed when there are changes that occur. And then finally, enforcing sanctions on those licensees who do fail to abide by the standards. Believe it or not, we have a lot of individuals that falsify applications. And I understand there could be some gray areas when you answer. Have you ever pled guilty to, right, or entered into an agreed disposition or some type of agreement with the government, right, that either withholds your plea or accepts your plea, but then you have to do some other things with regard to that guilty plea, right? So that it can ultimately be dismissed. When those questions are asked on the application, be very careful because while you might think it's expunged, for example, it might not be. And what I mean by that is, and I'll be very brief about this so as not to digress, but if you are ever arrested, then your arrest goes through a federal database, NCIC. And so when we conduct our criminal background checks, for example, anything from that federal database is going to show up. So if, for example, you were at a local court or a local county, right, and your attorney filed papers to have the matter expunged, but did not make sure that the NCIC, right, because the arresting officer has to go back and make sure that that is clear. If that is not done, just understand that that is going to show up. Now, it doesn't mean that you are not going to be able to hit a license. It just means that might be a little bit of a barrier as you try to provide us documentation, right, with the charging documents as well as with the expungement documents so that we can try to process that a little more quickly. So be aware of that as an area, again, of where the board takes its job very seriously, and that is monitoring those applications for licensure with that criminal background check component. Now, as we talk about the qualifications for licensure, there is a component of the CBC that suggests good moral character. Right now, young and dumb incidences where you are charged with, one open container back in the day of your college days. Perhaps one of those will not exclusively prevent you from obtaining a license. But if you have a pattern, for example, of different criminal offenses, then that certainly would raise an eyebrow, with the investigative team and then with the case review team. Because again, our job is to make sure that when a license is issued to a nurse applicant, that all of the requirements are fulfilled. And that does mean good moral character. So keep that in mind as you apply for licensure, be forthcoming with the board. If you're not sure, it's always better to disclose versus not, because at least we would have that information. But this slide just hones in on the point that criminal background check can speak a narrative about you that, again, may not be correct now, but again, we are looking at you on paper and we don't know that. So we have to be sure that the things that we're reading on paper, right, aren't pattern offenses and aren't to the level where if you are going to be given a license that, there would be some question about whether or not you could provide safe care. Some of the character traits here are what we're talking about when we talk about good moral character. Again, those arrests, the convictions, if there's disciplinary issues in school, it is inferred when you graduate from your program, because why else would you have been allowed into the nursing program and allowed to complete it and thus graduated, and then for the board to say, oh, well, we're sorry. But again, you have to be mindful of the fact that the criminal background check requirement with the nursing board is connected to the feds and through the FBI. And we have a extra layer, if you will, of security that's required when we conduct these. So it's not just come and get an appointment to get your fingerprints checked, right? It really is to evaluate and make sure that you are going to be a safe candidate, right? A safe candidate that we can entrust when a license is issued you. Applicants, just to let you know for some legal context, applicants do not have any property interest when it comes to obtaining a nursing license. Okay, well, what does that mean? Well, that just means because you're an applicant, you don't have any, special standing or there should not be given you any special treatment, if you will, to issue that license. Once you are licensed, the law says you now have a property interest. And if the board is going to challenge you if the board is going to challenge you as a holder of that license by, let's say, for example, charging that you violated a provision in the Nurse Practice Act or that you violated a rule or regulation, then there has to come with that a due process. You are allowed the opportunity to defend yourself. You are allowed to provide a defense on your behalf by providing witnesses that can testify or documentation that could support your side of the story, so that the board just can't take your license, okay? Now, again, we as a consumer protection agency are over the licensure aspect of you as a nurse. So when you see this slide, you see this license versus, the police sort of taking that individual away that's cuffed. So we have to be clear that we're over the license, not the person. But there could be some situations where a licensee finds themselves having to deal with both. So, for example, if there is diversion of controlled medications and the hospital or the facility brought charges against the nurse in a criminal forum, then you would have a licensure issue to deal with, as well as the criminal issue to deal with. And we've had situations where we've literally had to serve nurses who were imprisoned because we had summary suspended their license, understanding the situation of the criminal act, and basically having to supply them with due process that we were going to go forward to revoke that license. So it's not uncommon for there to be a licensure issue and a personal criminal issue, depending upon the violation and the criminal act. Very important for you to understand about how we operate is that we could not function without having a set of rules and without having a set of laws that give us that authority. The legislature, again, created the board through law. And then in that body of law, you find, as I mentioned earlier, the licensure requirements of what you need to do to become a licensed nurse. You will find in that body of law what happens when you do not abide by certain characteristics of being a nurse. So if there's a violation, for example, then that legal authority for the board to deny, suspend, revoke, take action upon, limit the license, put on probation, etc. That authority comes from the statute 7315-29. And then the hearing process is going to be within 7315-31. So those two statutes are really the legal portion of when the board decides that it needs to take action against a licensee who has violated, right? Who has not performed good nursing, who has, stolen from a patient, for example, who has taken medication from the patient for themselves, right? It could be a documentation issue, failure to document with a pattern that when they sign out the narcotics, they don't sign out to waste, right? So it's those things that we're talking about. Nursing practice is where the board gets involved when indeed there is a reported violation. Let's talk a little bit about how do we obtain these complaints? How do we know? How does the board know when to take action? Well, being a consumer protection agency, we rely upon the public to report to us. And once the public reports to us, and that public can include patients' family members, it can include the facility, it can include the nurse, him or herself. And so when that happens, the board has a duty to investigate. And that investigative authority is by statute that we are able to conduct an investigation to make sure if indeed the violation is true. Is there enough evidence to substantiate the charge? If there's not, the board will close the case. If it is, then it will proceed through the disciplinary process and perhaps even go to a hearing where the board panel will have to decide the fate of whether or not that individual will keep the license or whether or not that individual will have some discipline like classes, fines, or a limitation on practice, for example. But when the board does have a case that comes to the board, again, that complaint analysis happens. The case is assigned to an individual within the board who has that skill set to investigate the matter. They will develop an investigative plan and go out and speak to the nurse, the employer. They may speak to the patient. They may speak to family members of the patient. They may speak to law enforcement. All depends upon what has been reported to the board. But certainly there's a due diligence on the Board of Nursing's part to make sure that when we receive that allegation, that we investigate it thoroughly. Because at the end of the day, again, what's that duty that I told you about? What's the overall purpose? Protect the public. Yeah, I heard you loud and clear, right? And so that's what we have to make sure happens, is that we have exhausted all that we know from the board's point of view to make sure that, again, the licensee is competent and will provide safe practice. The board does have the ability to subpoena. And what that means is, given our statutory authority, what's in the law, that body of law, the Board of Nursing is able to subpoena documents from facilities. The Board of Nursing can subpoena documents really from anywhere. And then that authority extends even to having a subpoena for witness testimony. So again, we have that capability and authority to issue those subpoenas to make sure, again, that we are holding that licensee to the proper standard when it comes to nursing practice. Now, possible searches and sources that you will see that is the purview of an investigation is going to be, there are some searches, particularly when we're talking about facilities. Were we called prior to there being a search of the locker in the facility? Sometimes we just get pictures of what was taken, of what was inside that locker. We might get surveillance, an undercover operation where we can actually see and hear from the video the complaint itself. One great example is that we literally had a case one time where a nurse decided that he was going to steal the Pyxis machine. Yes, you heard me correctly. Not just a pill from the Pyxis machine. I'm talking about the whole machine. So you can imagine what that was like, watching a nurse on surveillance video roll a Pyxis machine off the floor into an elevator. Down we go, and then out the front door we go, only to realize that, oh, this Pyxis machine may not fit into my Toyota Corolla. Oops. Yes. So there was no question at that point, once we saw the video, that nurse was indeed guilty as charged for, trying to take the entire machine as well as the drugs that were in the machine. So the board did take action on that nurse, and the nurse did lose their license. Other possible sources of where complaints might come from, we might have them from a database. There may be information that's been sent to us because, we might get these emails, for example, that, just alert us to some interesting things going on about a nurse, and that database material involves some emails. Maybe they're harassment emails. Maybe they're emails of a conspiracy trying to steal the Pyxis machine, for example. So certainly that information comes to us. Mostly it comes from either a written complaint or an oral complaint or the video, as I said earlier. Other times we will get calls from other governmental entities. Sometimes there's a sting operation going on with the Department of Drug Enforcement. And so we will get in on that action by, obtaining what we need to obtain from a licensure standpoint, and they're going to obtain what they need from a criminal standpoint, as well as MBN, the Mississippi Bureau of Narcotics. We've also worked very closely with them as well, because you need to understand when you're nursing, you have the duty, one of the duties, or rather, is you're administering medication. Now, I'm sure that's a nothing in your mind, because that's what you're taught to do, and you're taught to document it. And there's ways to sign that medication out. There may be a machine that you have to get it from the dispense, the way it's filled, All of those things have tight controls, right? Because these are controlled medications. Well, you will find out here in a bit that nurses, unfortunately, have addictions. And because you have such access to that medication, there is a heightened sense when it relates to a drug allegation, for example. There's a heightened sense, right? Because how can an impaired nurse take care of a patient? How? So again, understand that that's why sometimes we do work with those entities, because when you're dealing with controlled substances, that means that federal law is now implicated, and you've got federal law, state law, criminal forums, and then the administrative law forum as it relates to your license that all come into play, and it doesn't look very good for that licensed nurse. Commonly forgotten sources, I want to mention Facebook and any other social media platform that you might be on. You may not realize that that information is discoverable, meaning that you can somehow protect that because of how you put your settings on privacy or whatever setting you did. But just understand that there is no expectation of privacy as it relates to Facebook. There is just absolutely zero. And I'm going to explain that here in momentarily. So hold that thought and we'll get back to it. Our standard of proof for the Board of Nursing, when we receive information, these allegations, and when we get the documents back and we're analyzing and our investigative team is looking to see, do we have a violation or do we not? Well, the standard is clear and convincing evidence. That's a legal standard that has been set by precedents. And what I mean by that is case law that's gone before courts of competent jurisdiction have set that ruling. And so we know when we're looking at a case that if we cannot meet a clear and convincing standard, then we don't have a case. And clear and convincing standard, best way to sort of explain that is it's 90% accurate. About 80 to 90% accurate. Whereas other burdens of proof, like preponderance of evidence, for example, is just tipping the scale slightly, 51% over 50, right? Clear and convincing, much higher, right? Not at the criminal level. The criminal level is going to be beyond a reasonable doubt, right? We're not there, but we're just under there when we're talking about the clear and convincing standard. We get patient records. We get dispense reports. We look at the MARS. We look at facility investigatory reports. Basically, when we get an allegation and we're getting this information from the facility, we are looking at your nursing practice on paper. So there is absolutely something to be said about the things you're learning in your classes now, which I'm sure, fundamentally, right? If you don't document, then what? It's not done, right? Well, the same goes for when we're looking at your nursing practice to see if a violation exists. If we're looking at a sloppy practice based on documentation, there could be some issues going on. So we may want to dig further. We may want to ask the facility, did you drug screen them? Was there any impairment that was observed? Was there an unsteady gait? Was there a dishevelment of the hair and, unkempt? Was there puncture marks visible on the skin? Believe it or not, we've had allegations of that just by noticing that on a nurse, and that helped us uncover that the nurse was stealing narcotics. So there's things like that we look at when we're analyzing evidence to be sure that it does indeed support the charge. Now, let's go back to social media, as I mentioned earlier, about it being a possible source to obtain information when we're talking about whether or not a nurse has indeed violated the nurse practice law. When you have issues like Facebook and you're trying to obtain that information, you need to know that your privacy is going to be forfeited. It could be, and let's say you say, well, how is that so? I've set my privacy settings to private, and I'm not even friends with this person that says that they can get that information from me. Well, guess what? If you liked something, or if you were friends of that friend that you were not Facebook friends with, right? If the Facebook friend you weren't friends with had a friend that y'all were both mutually friends of, if there's a like or anything like that, it's discoverable. So you don't think that it's a black and white issue of they're not my friend, therefore they can't get the information. It doesn't work like that. There's a U.S. Supreme Court case that says there is no expectation of privacy as it relates to Facebook. And, I could harp on that, probably could do a whole hour on this, because what we see at the board, and we're going to see a case down the road here when we talk about some application, what we see is a disconnect, especially with you new nurses or nurse wannabes, that there's a virtual world and then there is, right, your professional world. And your virtual world is your social, is your nursing hats off. You've clocked out. So therefore you are able to say anything on these sites because you're functioning now as just a regular human being, right? An American citizen that has all these First Amendment rights, et cetera. Be careful. Be very, very careful, because you can still have a First Amendment right to post things. However, if you post information about a patient, any identifying information about a patient, and HIPAA makes it to where if you just, have anything, even if it's generic, HIPAA law is more likely than not going to still find you guilty. If you put anything like that on your Facebook page, that trumps your First Amendment right. You're toast. You're toast because you violated HIPAA. So if I could say anything, I implore you, please, please, please do not make this distinction that you can have a social world over here with all the social media and then the professional world of doing your nursing job. They bleed together because you never stop really being a nurse. And when you're on social media, you are representing yourself still as a professional, as a nurse, and information that you are discussing as it relate to your job could cost you your job and could cost you a federal lawsuit that you violated HIPAA. So be aware, be very, very aware. Post at your own risk. Again, I'm not telling you not to use social media platforms, but I am begging you to understand the seriousness of getting caught up and thinking that you can just post anything. And Facebook does that, right? Facebook, it kind of enables you to talk about when you've had your first cup of coffee and how good it was, or where you went for dinner, or what you saw at the movie, and blah, blah, blah. But then the lines get blurred. And again, then you start talking about your day. Then you start talking about the patients you've seen. And then you start dropping some identifying information. Even if you say that patient down the hall, that still could be a HIPAA violation. That they wouldn't take their medicine. They were ornery today, whatever. Facebook is not nursing notes. Facebook is not nursing notes. But I guarantee you start talking about your profession on Facebook, it becomes nursing notes. And it can be very damaging, not only to your career, but to your licensing, because there will be discipline imposed, okay? So harped enough about that. Let's move now into top allegations. No surprise, drugs. We've got drug, alcohol abuse, diversion, working while impaired as our top drug allegations. We have documentation issues that's coming in second. And that just means that, again, nurses sometimes, when they sign out medications, they don't, sign that they've administered those medications, or they're not wasting properly, or they've given the wrong medication, which, again, mistakes do happen. But the board is interested in, is there a pattern? Is there a reason behind these mistakes? Is there an impairment behind these mistakes? Is it just sloppy nursing? Is it a systems issue where it's truly an overwhelming situation that needs to be looked at with regard to how many patients you've been assigned? That can be part of it, but ultimately, the buck stops with you. You've got the license. You've been charged with your duty. You're seeing patients, and if part of your duty is to administer those medications, then if they're not documented, that is considered to be a violation. Practicing outside the scope. Know your lane. Know your lane. If you are going to be this registered nurse, right, and you're going to be the best registered nurse, then this is not the time for you to function as a nurse practitioner, because you are an RN. You are here. Okay. So we've had cases where, RNs, and again, all in good intent, became doctors because they did not like the order and felt like the order was not a good order for the patient. So they changed it. They gave them a different medication. No, no, no. Stay in your lane. Stay in your lane. Certainly, you want to be an advocate for the patient, but there's policy and how to do that. And you need to follow that policy with your facility and certainly document that conversation was had. And it doesn't mean that you can do whatever you want to do, because that license gives you one lane. And you just need to make sure that you stay in that lane, okay? The final top allegation is patient abuse and neglect. That just kills my soul because unfortunately we still have those allegations that come in. I've been with the board 14 years and I've seen a little bit of everything. Unfortunately, we had a case where there was a nurse that took a straightening iron because she was home health and she was fixing the patient's hair and decided that she was going to burn the neck of the patient because the patient would not give her her Lortab. We've had case like that. We've had cases where there was force by the nurse that pinned a patient down that was in a vulnerable unit. And when that nurse pinned the patient down, jabbed the syringe into the hip, bruised the patient, just awful. There were witnesses involved, which that's another story. There was a whole hearing on that case, but ultimately we were able to impose disciplinary action against that license. So we do have that abuse, unfortunately, as an allegation. Now that technology has become a little more involved with healthcare, we do have more video surveillance, and I'm hopeful that that helps. But sometimes there's not surveillance in every patient room. And so there again, that becomes an issue because it becomes a he said and a she said. So we stay on top of that and we try to educate best we can, because there's just nothing worse when you look at pictures of patients that have been abused by a nurse, because that you just cannot justify that. There is just no justification whatsoever for that. So those are our top four. Let's talk a little bit about drug abuse. These are just some commentary taken from at the federal level, the Health and Human Services. I'll just read these to you. As you can see on the slide, the blue section does say if you take a medicine in a way that is different from what the doctor prescribed, it's called prescription drug abuse. And that's an interesting issue because so much now of the opioid epidemic, right? And then, of course, we've had a pandemic. There may be some mental health issues that even stem from that. The board is not saying to you that you cannot take a medication prescribed to you, right? Because that's discriminatory. That's outside our lane. But what we are saying is that if you are abusing the way you are taking that medicine, what has been prescribed, right, by that provider, if you are doing your own, your own way, your own order, then you're gonna have an issue with the board. Okay. If that medication is not functioning in a way with your body system so that it makes you lulu, then it's your responsibility to contact the provider and let them know and get off the unit. Stop your patient care. Because ultimately, while we certainly don't want to interfere with your own medical necessity and issues you may be having, when it crosses the line into potential nursing violations because of impairment, right? That again would impede your nursing practice, then that's where the board steps in because it becomes a public protection issue. All right. The red slide, young adults ages 18 to 25 are the biggest abusers of narcotics, ADHD stimulants. They are selling those drugs on college campuses as we speak. We've seen a lot, an uptick of those ADHD drugs go out the roof. Okay. And then finally, nurses with an untreated addiction can jeopardize patient safety because of judgment, slower reaction time. You're diverting drugs from patients for their own use and they neglect the patients. And that makes sense. That makes sense what it does. It is a disease and certainly it's a treatable disease, but drug abuse and patient care, will never go hand in hand. It will just not work. So be mindful of these points regarding drug abuse. Let's get into some cases and talk about some facts of these cases and an application of law. Case number 1. I entitled this, Are You Really Alive? I do try to give some themes to my cases because sometimes the facts of some of these cases are so incredulous. You really are going, what? Seriously? So there are times where I do label cases because it helps me keep that frame of mind of, this is insane, but this happened. So this case is, Are You Really Alive? Should already alert you to something big going on. And it did. So let's talk about the facts. This particular case, there was a nurse that was on shift and she worked in a hospital and she started out with a hep block and a morphine. So already knowing that's how the shift started, things are only going to go downhill from there, right? So she did that 1 or 2 times. So she was, had a good morphine dose within her and was, wrongfully continuing to stay and provide nursing care. Left at that time and went to a Mexican restaurant for drinks. So we're at the Mexican restaurant and we're having drinks on top of having the morphine in our system, but that's not enough. So when it's time to go, let's put another hep block, another morphine, 4 milligrams, and phenergan in my system, right? Let's just continue this process of letting me feel nothing. So that happens. And what eventually occurs is a single vehicle accident, and literally the vehicle was found upside down. I don't know how many times it rotated. It's been a bit on this case, but the police report described it pretty well. But someone stopped, and actually the person that stopped happened to be another nurse. Isn't that interesting? So the nurse that observed it, pulled over, tried to help, and was amazed that literally the nurse that was in the accident was unscathed. It was unscathed, but there was some stuff in the car that was not right. Box of drugs and a purse of stuff. So that, of course, when the authorities got there, that had to be dealt with. And you can see here from the slide that the police recovered, bag of syringes, an empty phenergan vial, and empty morphine vial. What else did they find? Well, they had more empty phenergan vials, more empty morphine, lidocaine, a syringe with 3.5 milliliters of milky substance that later was tested and actually confirmed positive for propofol. There was a bottle of open pills labeled Zofran. And if that's not enough, we had an empty bottle labeled Xanax. We had a bottle of open pills labeled Zyniel or Yazel. A bottle of open pills labeled Seroquel. You see, it just goes on and on and on. So you can already see why I even asked the question, are you really alive? Because it was just incredible, the amount of drugs that was found in her car. And, we don't really know what she admitted to and then what she was drug tested for. It was just a massive amount of narcotics, okay? And certainly someone that needed some help. That's just not normal, right? That's not normal. And so on top of that, the very day that this all went down, when she started the day with the hep block and morphine, there was patient harm issues. There was a documentation by her as having administered propofol 5 times with an infusion rate of 33.3 milliliters an hour. Okay, an average time of 2.5. That's insane. That's fast. That's really fast. And the last infusion prior to leaving shift was 6:41 a.m. and the infusion started again at 10:12 a.m. So, put the pieces together. She definitely was siphoning off some of that propofol and then was trying to cover it up by infusing this at a much higher rate than what was originally ordered. Ultimately, this individual did surrender needed to surrender. Our understanding is that she did go and obtain the help that was needed. The medication that was in her car did come from the facility, and the facility did verify that and matched, each and every bottle with a patient. So there was lots going on there. So again, you can see that there's even a criminal issue there that the facility took up with the licensed nurse, because that was just insane for her to have had that much medication in her car. All right, let's go to case 2. Here are the facts. And you can kind of tell the T's from the first slide. The nurse took pictures of the workstation, and that station, it included information about patient's name, the room number, et cetera, et cetera. Well, and it really was meant to be this post that was, hey, I'm here at work and it's quiet night, look at me kind of deal. Well, when the photo was taken, detailed doctor's orders could be seen from the photo. I mean, all you had to do was zoom a little bit and it was very clear. And so that you had the room number, you had the name, you had the doctor's orders, right? And then that friend or that nurse decides to send that via Facebook Messenger. Insane. Again, the intent was not to exploit the patient, right? But I want to point out, it doesn't matter the intent. The fact that the photo was taken and that information was disseminated via a social media platform is absolutely strict liability HIPAA violation, okay? It's a HIPAA violation. So you need to be aware that when you think that you're doing these selfies all in fun, first of all, there's going to be a policy and procedure of social media when you are employed, and you need to heed that. And this is why you heed that, because again, not intentionally, but unintentionally, that information is going to be shared and a HIPAA violation will occur, okay? That doesn't diminish the violation. It doesn't diminish the punishment, okay? So you just need to know that. The authority by which we charged that nurse was unprofessional conduct, and that was going to be found further in the Administrative Code, Part 2820, Rule 1.2N, in that the respondent violated the confidentiality of information or knowledge concerning the patient. And that individual actually received a reprimand, a fine, and some classes, okay? Now, disciplinary options. This is not something the board can just make up willy-nilly. When a board hears a case, or if the case is settled and the board panel is reviewing all of this information, the panel just cannot decide on any given day what to impose, okay? All of these options are within the law. The board has to have authority to impose, but the board also has to have the law to spell out for them the options available to them, so that they are not exceeding their authority when they impose any action upon a nurse's license. So you see here the list, the denial of licensure, and that comes from when we deny applications for licensure based on whatever it is. It could be that criminal past that we talked about in earlier slides. It could be a recent, drug issue that, again, we would need to deny the license for that. There's revocation that they can impose, summary suspension that can be imposed, and certainly the education that we talked about, and then the evaluation. There are times, particularly when we talk about drug issues or drug abuse, the board does have authority to ask that you submit to a substance use evaluation, so that the assessor who is trained in the area of chemical dependency can evaluate you using the objective tools that are available to these assessors to ultimately determine a diagnosis. So the board can even do that. And I think that we have definitely done that numerous times. And that has proven helpful for the board and for the nurse with regard to trying to know kind of what was next. What's the next steps? Do we need the inpatient treatment? Is this nurse okay to not practice for a while, but go to just a meeting, some counseling, some outpatient treatment. So there's all these variables and various forms depending on the spectrum of how bad that they how bad they are, and that's determined by a trained professional that has the credentials that can provide the board that diagnosis. Again, the board does not have that authority to diagnose anyone with substance abuse, but the board does have authority to make sure that that nurse goes to an evaluator that's approved by the board and has those credentials so that we know that they're going to be a safe licensee. All right. Yes, that outcome, as I said before, they did get classes and a fine. And I forgot to mention that they were suspended for 6 months, which is harsh, and that they were on probation for 12 months. Now, anytime that the board decides to limit the practice of a nurse when they impose a disciplinary outcome, you need to be mindful that that changes the multi-state status. Okay, why is that? Well, we are part of a nurse licensure compact. And in that compact, among 36 states, there is a uniform licensure requirement. And in those uniform licensure requirements, it does involve that if a nurse license has been encumbered, an encumbrance pursuant to the nurse licensure compact means a restriction on nurse practice. So if you have a suspension or if you have probation, that's going to be a limitation on nurse practice. So the status of the multi-state license will change to a single state status. So there's layers here and how disciplinary action can impact your multi-state license status. So just wanted to mention that as well. Okay, case 3. Wonder what we're dealing with here. I really did entitle this Seriously. This is my seriously case. So let's look at the facts here. So we have a final order of the board in 2016. This individual was placed on non-drug probation for falsifying an assessment of a patient during a home visit when the patient was in the hospital. Okay, so that was the underlying reason we were looking at this nurse, a final order, non-drug probation for falsifying an assessment. All right, we move forward to early 2017. This individual decides to falsify an employer report and submits that to the compliance officer. So one of the requirements of that 2016 order was for them to submit an employer report. Well, there was a question as to whether what was submitted was actually submitted by that nurse. And, the way it was written, the handwriting, just, it was just suspect. So we verified that employee report, and sure enough, it was not completed by the supervisor. Let's continue on. Summer of 2017, the same individual was indicted for attempting to acquire or possess a controlled substance by misrepresentation. Okay, so let's add to this issue of being disciplined by the board, falsifying a document that's out of compliance, right, makes you out of compliance, and there's some criminal intent here. And then we have an indictment for attempting to acquire, possess a controlled substance. What happened was there was a presentation of an unauthorized prescription to a pharmacy for Norco for a quantity of 120 pills. And we're not done. So in summer of 2017, after that information was learned by the board, we of course stepped in and decided that, okay, we can't just allow this nurse to practice under this 2016 non-drug probation. There is something going on. So we summarily suspended this nurse's license. That's the harshest penalty that the board can impose because it is immediate. It is immediate. When we do that, we do have to inform the nurse that that's what we're doing, and we do have to afford the nurse the opportunity to have a hearing, which we did. Okay, well, let's progress here with our timeline. So now we get into the fall of 2017, and the nurse decides to hire an attorney. And as we are working through the case with the attorney and preparing for a hearing in winter of 2017, then we all of a sudden get a call from a veterans home requesting to verify a license and receive public information on an individual. Would you believe that this nurse not only had all of that going on in 2016, right? And then was indicted, falsified a report. Now, this nurse is working at 2 different facilities, utilizing a license number assigned to someone else. We now have, ladies and gentlemen, a nurse imposter. A nurse imposter. Because this person whose license had been summarily suspended was now imposing themselves at this facility and posing as a nurse, misrepresenting that they are able to provide nursing care because they have a license, when in all actuality, they didn't. So you can imagine, yes, the slide says it all. Like, seriously? This is true, though. I can't make this up. So what happens? So we did treat this case as an imposter case. And when the board does that, we do have the ability to issue a cease and desist order. We also have statutory authority to work in conjunction with the district attorney's office in the county in which the nurse resides. And that's exactly what we did, so that we can prosecute that nurse criminally. We also have a national database that we have to report to, and that is a federal mandate. And that federal mandate requires the board to alert all boards of nursing in the nation, okay? And we're also sort of talking about territories within the U.S. as well of this individual, so that they will be made aware not to employ this person. So ultimately, after all of this, finally, the nurse decides to surrender her license. She does sign it over, and we can finally put the seriously case to bed. You need to know that discipline is public. We are subject to the Mississippi Public Records Act of 1983. Now, what that means is, if a document is public, then any member of the public that wants to know anything about a nurse can petition the board, request from the board any public information. And part of that public information request does include disciplinary action. It could mean the agreement that the nurse is under with the board. It could mean that there's a final order from the hearing and the transcript and the evidence involved that would also be considered public. So there is a statute, again, that the board has to abide by as it relates to public information. And we have to make the records available for inspection and provide the public the actual document within a day's time. Again, the mission is to protect the public. It's all with that intent in mind, but you just need to be made aware that the Public Information Act does not exempt disciplinary action. You know, I put this slide here to demonstrate again that, you know, this is how public it gets. I mean, we're living in a world where I don't even know if we have a protection of privacy, really. And I say that, you know, half joking, half not, because there are certain laws in place for privacy, but the internet and the technology that the world that we live in now certainly connects us to a plethora of information. And so, you know, if you think that, oh, people won't know, well, just look, you know, this is public right here, right? Just by Googling information. So, you know, you don't want to be that headline. You know, you certainly don't want to be that headline. All right, as we talked about public information, let's now talk about the National Practitioner Data Bank. This data bank is a federal depository, and it functions kind of like a docket, if you will, and it shows any and all disciplinary activity of a nurse, including if that activity has been removed or if that activity has been satisfied by the nurse. So it functions as everything that happens. It tracks that nursing discipline. That's what it does. does. And we are required, pursuant to federal law, to report any adverse action taken by the licensing or the certified authority of the state, which is an administrative licensing board, like the Board of Nursing. Okay, so you need to know that this is a mandate. This is not something that's negotiable. We get fined $11,000 a day if we don't report this information within a timely fashion. And you need to know that nurses came on the scene for the mandate back in the 80s, the mid 80s. Doctors were always first because the public, and this is big Congress, talking about federal Congress, there was a need for the public to know that who they were going to see, their doctor. They wanted to know that they were competent, that there weren't any issues out there about them. They hadn't been committing malpractice here and there. The public felt like there was a need to know, and that need to know was greater than protecting the doctor from the public scrutiny of whatever issues that there were. Well, nurses came on the scene in the 80s. And this is through the Social Security Act, okay? And this is important just to let you know that, again, you functioning as a healthcare worker, it just doesn't stop of you supplying that at the local level. You may not think that it's bigger than you, but it is. It is so much bigger than you. And so you want to be mindful that, nursing practice, okay, and licensing issues, hopefully you won't have them. But if you do, they are going to be reported into this depository and they cannot be expunged. This is not state law. This is federal law. They cannot be expunged. So they follow you. And you certainly want to prevent at all costs having discipline and having them reported. You can see here the list that who reports, and I've highlighted for you there that state licensing and certification authorities, we have that duty, and that's under Section 1921 of the Social Security Act. Again, what is reported? This came straight from the National Practitioner Data Bank laws and rules. So I just want to make sure I'm pointing out to you that these issues that are reported, again, include state licensure actions. What is the nurse voluntary program? I'm happy to say that, let me go back here. I'm happy to say that I was able to help get this program started at the board. It's near and dear to my heart. And that's interesting because it used to not be near and dear to my heart. I am tough. And I always felt like, nurses, if they were abusing drugs, and certainly if they're in the practice, they needed to have their practice stopped. They need to have their practice stopped. What I did not understand until much later and doing research, quite frankly, and having conversations and getting to understand that the abuse was a disease and it's a treatable disease, right? Now, it doesn't mean that I'm soft now and that I'm going to say, oh, well, okay, you have a substance abuse problem. We're just not going to do anything. No, don't misunderstand. It's an education of understanding of what needs to happen, of how to better benefit the nurse and how to protect the public in one program. And so now we have the Mississippi Nurse Voluntary Program. One of the things that I learned in doing some research was that nurse graduates in the top 1/3 of the class are more disposed to substance use issues. Just digest that for a minute. You may even know someone, the smarties at the class have a lot of pressure. They want to continue to stay at the top, right? And that pressure to do so might weigh heavily on them to the point where they may abuse a controlled substance. And when they do, it is inevitable. They will be caught. They will be caught. But it is interesting to me that statistic is real. And then the fact that 20% of nurses will abuse controlled substances. I mean, just do the math. However many people are in your graduating class, multiply that by 20%. What do you get? It's astounding. It's astounding, because it just goes to show that the nursing profession is stressful. You are you're providing a service. You are providing healthcare. And one of your duties is to administer that medication. And then on top of that, you may be assigned more patients than you can handle. You're on your feet. It's physically, mentally, emotionally draining. Now, it is rewarding, but there are some things about nursing practice that I think are important to point out, so that you don't allow yourself to abuse controlled substances, right? So that you can keep up, because that's what we're seeing. We're seeing the ones that, truly are trying to take the drug, the ADHD medicine, to stay up, and then take a sedative to sleep at night. And then it becomes this cyclical thing where, now we have an addiction. Or it could be as simple as having a back injury. Maybe you got on the job and lifting a patient, and so you've been prescribed a pain medication to treat that. And then now it's become an abuse situation. So it's real. It's real. And the research certainly suggests that. Now, top 4 risk factors of nurses, when we're talking about the nursing profession, are access. That makes sense. Access. Attitude. And what I mean by that, I don't mean like this kind of attitude. I mean like the perception of how you think about controlled medications, because we now live in a world where if it's prescribed, it's justified. If it's prescribed, it's justified. So we don't go there that it could be an abuse, right? Because the doctor gave you a prescription, or a nurse practitioner gave me the prescription. So I think we have to be mindful of, you need to change the narrative about how you think when it comes to these controlled medications. They're controlled medications, and they're controlled medications for a reason. Okay. Now, they may be medically necessary to treat an underlying issue, right? We're not going to take away that fact, but that doesn't mean that they can't be abused or that you can't become addicted. So we just need to change that narrative of how we talk about controlled substances. It can't just be, okay, well, we're going to go give them 5 this morphine, this, and it's a nothing. Well, I get that that's part of the business. But what I'm saying is, don't be so flippant, right, to think it couldn't happen to you, because it can. All right. Stress. Nurses, you work hard. It's going to be I would say, I know it's the number 1 most ethical profession, but I would venture to say it's probably the most hardworking profession, physically, mentally, emotionally, because you are literally providing a service, a healthcare service, the hands, the feet, the eyes, the ears of healthcare. So certainly that can be take its toll. And then lack of education. I think that some of the factors of, so when someone gets addicted, or when you find out someone is, what do? Well, we judge them. We criminalize what they've done. Now, certainly they've done a bad thing. Certainly they've done something that is against the law. There's no doubt about it. But again, they could have a disease of addiction that's quite treatable. And instead of imputing upon them a stigma that they're a criminal, we need to be mindful that they have an addiction and they have a disease. And yes, they do not need to be practicing nursing while they are treating that disease, but it is treatable. And there is research that suggests that once that process begins of recovery, then there is room for transitioning back into nursing practice with proper monitoring. This legislation to create the program did come from House Bill 1519, and it just literally allowed the board to have the authority to promulgate rules to establish an alternative to discipline program. And that's indeed what happened. And the 3 R's that are important that we try to educate nurses about is that, to really effectively treat this disease, there needs to be a large portion of this education dedicated to prevention. Because if we can stop some of it from the onset, then certainly it would help the back end, right, of there being of it happening. So if there are signs and symptoms that can be educated with employers, then perhaps we can remove the nurse at a quicker rate, get them the help they need by rehabilitating them, and then having the opportunity to re-enter them and back into nursing practice safely, right? And the key word is safely. A few more points on the program. It reduces prevalence by 20%. There's 75% more enrollees, and that is because if nurses know this program is a non-discipline program, because that's what alternative to discipline means. If it's a non-disciplinary program, then the reporting would increase. Statistically, and research shows that reporting will increase of these substance use issues if the nurse knows that they're not going to have their license taken away. So that we then can help get that person evaluated, get a plan for their nursing practice, first on the rehabilitation of their person, and then we establish some boundaries and some criteria for them to eventually get back to nursing under the guidance, again, of the professionals. Our retention rates are 68% and growing. These programs work. Statistically, these programs work because if the nurse, again, knows that the license is not going to be immediately ripped from them, but they can pause their nursing practice, seek the help, right? Become rehabilitated, then there's going to be a plan for reentry. And all of that can basically help the nurse and help the public. So we're serving two roles. We're rehabilitating the nurse and we're helping to rehabilitate the nurse. And we are also doing our job and due diligence to protect the public. Because that, again, that is our overall arching goal, and that is to protect the public. This does conclude the presentation today. I hope you've learned a little bit about the Mississippi Board of Nursing, the licensure criteria. I hope that you have learned some case studies and could understand some application of law and then what the board actually imposed. I know I can't see you today, and I hate that because I do love doing these things live. But I really hope none of you ever darken the door of the legal division of the board. But on the other side, I hope that you would want to come and visit the board. You're certainly welcome to. We are a consumer protection agency. We are a form of your government. Our makeup is to do our job to basically provide licenses, right, to competent, safe nurses. I wish you all the best of luck, and I hope you become the best nurse that you can be. And if you ever have questions, I hope that you do not hesitate to contact me. And here's my website, my email here at the bottom, or if there's anyone else at the board that can assist you in any way, we want to connect you there, okay? Be safe. God bless. Thank you.